Hello to everyone who's joined us and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's portion of Art Talk Live. My name is Soyoung Lee, and I'm the Landon and Lavinia Clay Chief Curator here at the Harvard Art Museums. And I will serve as today's moderator since our regular moderator, Lynette, is off this week. Now, as we begin today's talk, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. Art Talks Live, as many of you know, offer an up-close look at works from our collection with our team of curators, conservators, fellows, and graduate students. And these short interactive talks investigate artists' materials and techniques, reveal our latest discoveries, and explore big ideas using the collections of the Harvard Art Museums. Now, before we get started, I want to share just a few logistics about today's talk. So we are using the webinar format in Zoom, so you'll notice that your microphones are muted and your videos are turned off. We invite you to submit brief questions to our presenter via the Q&A box. So not the chat box, but the Q&A box at the bottom, which you should have access to on the bottom of your screen. The presentation will last approximately 15 minutes, and we'll dedicate the last 10 or 15 minutes to Q&A. But please feel free to type in the questions at any point during the presentation. We will answer them at the end of the program after the presentation is over. And we'll try our best to get to as many of the questions as possible, but we do have a large crowd today, so it may not be possible to reach all of them. Today's talk is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website in the coming weeks. And we will try to conclude the talk close to 1 p.m. And now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce my colleague, Joachim Homann, who is the presenter today. Joachim is the Harvard Art Museum's Maida and George Abrams Curator of Drawings. And today he will speak about watercolors by the artist John Marin in the Harvard's collection that reflect the artist's travels in the White Mountains, New Hampshire. And this talk is part of an ongoing reevaluation of Harvard's distinguished collection of American watercolors that will culminate in an exhibition in the summer of 2023. So with this briefest of introductions, I'm delighted to turn things over to Joachim.
Thank you so much, Soyoung, and welcome everyone. Happy New Year to all of us who celebrate Rosh Hashanah today. I'm delighted we have a chance to look at watercolors by John Marin today that are among my favorite works in the collection of American watercolors at the Harvard Art Museums. As Soyoung mentioned, we are currently systematically studying watercolors, focusing on about 100 years from the 1880s to the 1990s, from the generation of Winslow Homer, John Lafarge, and John Singer Sargent, to Richard Tuttle, Susan Frecon, and many others. Among the best-known watercolor artists in America ranks John Marin, whose output was very significant and whose handling of the watercolor paint is immediately recognizable. John Marin was born in New Jersey in 1870 and spent much of his adult life in the New York area. However, his heart was in New England, specifically in Maine, where he spent summers, first in the mid-coast area, then in Stonington, and eventually down east in a coastal home that he enjoyed very much for the later years of his life. He died in Maine in 1953. Marin's main watercolors and paintings are among the most interesting and dynamic renderings of the coastal environment ever produced in the state, which is so saturated with art. What might perhaps be lesser known are his works in the White Mountains, which we will examine today. Before I came back to Harvard in 2019, I was a curator in a small Maine museum for 10 years, and I got to know Marin's work a little bit then and became aware of the following that he still has. As curator of drawings at Harvard, I'm now delighted to work with a collection that offers many absolutely stunning watercolors from all periods of Marin's artistic career. And all are fabulous, I think. I thought it would be fun to focus today on the works from the White Mountains because I wanted to find out how Marin transformed a scenery that many of us might know and that I could easily get to this beautiful summer. The idea was to hop in the car and look at the view Marin depicted to compare and contrast. At this time of the year, that's my favorite kind of art historical research. And the road trip to New Hampshire did turn out to be absolutely wonderful. It is such a gorgeous part of the world. A second trip then brought me to New York City, where Marin has shown his watercolors and his paintings since the early 20th century when he first established himself as an artist in the 19 teens, always in the best galleries. And that tradition has continued even after his passing. Coincidentally, next week, Menconi and Shellkop Fine Art, a gallery on the Upper West Side that now represents the Marin estate, will open a wonderful exhibition of his work, and it is going to be dedicated to John Marin's views of the White Mountains. It's a really wonderful coincidence, a confluence of many people who care about John Marin. I was flabbergasted when I received Andy Shellkop's email alerting me of this confluence, and delighted to read an essay by our mutual friend, Ruth Fine, the former curator of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., an essay that the gallery had commissioned for this particular show. Ruth Fine's earlier catalog of the John Marin retrospective that she mounted of John Marin's work at the National Gallery, as well as our director Martha Tedeschi's catalog, a groundbreaking presentation of his watercolors that she organized at the Art Institute of Chicago, are still the best reference works for John Marin's work. And I draw your attention to them in case you want to follow up on this lecture by learning a little bit more. The work I would like to discuss first is titled Mount Chocorua #1. You see it here on the screen. It immediately captured my attention when I saw it recently in the Art Study Center for the first time. The blues and greens look incredibly fresh when you have the work in front of you, and you get that sense on this new photo that we took just for today. And what is stunning about it is that the work seems to be stirring and churning right in front of your face without falling apart. It has, whenever you look at it, offers a wonderful dynamic. You discover a lot of surprises as you get to know the work better. I'm going to show you 3 details that I feel help us to hone in on this very compelling work. The slice on the left shows how an underdrawing of bold charcoal lines structures the sheet. They serve to hold in place color fields, almost like a leaded glass window where the different paints are kept in place through the little metal rods. These lines are only occasionally justified as a representation of something. There seems to be a group of barren trees that provide a grid-like structure to the work. Those tree trunks are accentuated with black brush strokes, as you can see, applied with a fairly dry brush, and they give the work a jazzy rhythm. What you can also see in all the details is how Marin then uses the white of the paper to create a brightness that's unique to watercolor. The colors in this medium, and Marin does that beautifully, are applied in glazes, and they filter the light that's reflected back from the sheet to create these jewel-like tones, overlaying blues, as you can see in these examples, become really intense, while strokes of greens and yellows blend to bright color fields. There are also light blue fields that are applied with so much water, if you look at the left example, perhaps on a wet sheet, that the pigment accumulates around the edges. Sometimes Marin enforces this effect with additional silhouetting lines. The center detail in this slide reveals most clearly the structure, which reminds me of a stained glass window. Deep colors separated by black lines drawn in charcoal and strengthened with a brush. I keep coming back at the barren top of Mount Chocorua, which glows in a pink light that produces dramatic dark shading. And that top is juxtaposed with a square, deep blue mark. Further below, a staccato of short black strokes sits on the watery green. I think this is Marin at his best. The detail on the right, which includes Marin's signature and the date of the work, 1926, reveals a very important compositional device, the framing. One can see how Marin surrounds his motif with a frame of white paper in something of an oval shape and tightens it with lines such as the squiggly dark line, black wave. There are also some buttresses that seem to anchor the composition. Looking at the watercolor again as a whole, it is quite wonderful to see how Marin balances the improvisational quality of the details with a symmetrical structure, which identifies the energy center with the blue square in the center. The whole thrust of the work is directed upwards, with the top of the mountain creating an arrow pushing into the heaven. I have to admit that it was this blue square that made me want to give this talk. I wanted to find out what this is and what it might mean or might have meant to the artist. We'll come back to it. We are very lucky to be able to compare a second view of the same mountain from the same year, from 1926, that, like the first example, has been at Harvard already since 1928. Titled Mount Chocorua number 5, it is similarly impressive, but operates very differently. With this work, it is the saturation and lusciousness of greens that is incredibly satisfying. It is hard to describe the effect of these greens, and I hope the detail gives you a better sense of what I mean. In the center of the view, an expanse of dark forest green invites your eyes to linger. It is barely shaped and almost has the appearance of a green puddle, but without losing any of the pigment's intensity. It is framed by firm black hatching on the top, extends into a blue appendix to the left, enhanced by a shimmer of yellow and short black vertical strokes nearby. And on the right, it is set against a dry passage that leaves lots of paper uncovered. To the bottom, black hooks indicate treetops. You can see them in this detail just at the bottom. By contrasting the dark greens with aqua-colored sky and a reddish rock face on the mountaintop, Marin teases the green to show itself, to come out and develop its energy rather than letting it recede. Rhythmic details, such as the 3 dark circles in a rectangle that you see on the right side in the sky, also provide an energy like percussion instruments. There are so many ideas at work that one really doesn't tire of looking at this work. I personally find it tempting to enjoy these works as abstract displays of color and form, but the third White Mountain watercolor from 1927 makes clear that this is not, or not exclusively, what Marin is after. This work presents the view of a mountain range. I would be grateful for someone to identify these mountains for me. Please let me know in the Q&A box if you have an idea which specific mountains in New Hampshire these are. And these of the mountain ranges, of course, are in characteristic fashion surrounded by forest, like they would be in New Hampshire. The succession of 3 adjoining peaks is kept much lighter and feels calmer than the works we just looked at previously. The framing of this work is interesting. A reserve of white paper extends all around the work, slightly angled for a more dynamic effect. And in the lower right, it appears somewhat stepped up, reflecting the rising terrain. My favorite detail here is the charcoal framing inside the work that makes you feel like you're looking through a viewfinder of a camera. It seems more prominent when you look at the original, but even in this photo, you can make it out a little bit. To me, this is a reminder that Marin always found inspiration in looking at the landscape. He most enjoyed working in front of the motif outdoors. But his letters to his friend and gallerist, the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, also indicate that he kept working on his watercolors once he was back home in New Jersey. The locales he visited did not stop challenging and inspiring him once they were out of sight. Like many of his contemporaries, John Marin enjoyed road trips with his car, especially the annual trip from New Jersey to Maine, briefly interrupted by 2 summer vacations in New Mexico in the late 1920s, gave him the opportunity to enjoy the New England countryside. This was, of course, long before the interstate highway system was built. Marin would have relied on the automobile Blue Book for directions. The map I'm showing here is from the Blue Book's edition of 1921, just a detail that shows you the area that he would have passed from Mount Chocorua, which is in the very uppermost corner on the left side, to mid-coast Maine, which is on the right side of this detail. Like many of his the map I'm showing here is from 1921, as I mentioned. It allowed readers to plan their trips and piece together directions. Roads were at the time connections between towns and villages rather than entire regions, and longer trips required hundreds of turns that would have been unwieldy to trace on a map. The Blue Book encouraged travel on the most scenic routes by giving directions for all of these twists and turns in the roadway, and rather than giving you the quickest connection, it planned scenic travel for leisure tourists. Marin reflected in a letter to Stieglitz on his desire to articulate a personal vision, make his renderings of the landscape unmistakably his own. And he was very aware that this vision was shaped in part by the automobile, which he loved driving around. So I'm quoting from this edited letter published in 1949, but written in August 1927 to his friend Alfred Stieglitz from Stonington, Maine. I find myself constantly juggling with things, playing one thing against another. And then when I get through, they look so much like Marin, they act like Marin. So I have got to spoil more paper. I don't know anybody who loves their visions more than I do, but not to absolutely get them down. That's what makes me speak of spoiling paper. As I drive a good deal, I'm conscious of the road, the wonderful, everlasting road, a leading onward, a dipping, a rising, a leading up over the hill to the sea beyond. To nail that, to express that, to find the means to clutch, so that there it is. That's what torments me, to show with startling conviction. So I make the attempt. Others may make it and get, but don't you see, it isn't my road, it isn't my over the sea, and here it is. You get a sense of Marin's writing, which is very compelling and as improvised as many of his works seem to be. As I read that, I felt encouraged by John Marin to hop into the car myself and discover the open road that led me, like him, from Maine to Mount Turkura. And here is a photo that I just took the other day in mid-August, a really absolutely wonderful place, as you can see. For me, it's interesting to see how Marin was shaped by his time, as the quote that I just read indicates. His modernity was indeed steeped to a certain degree in his love of the machine, the car, the boats and motors that he tended to. For him and his contemporaries, the machine age was clearly expressed in the works, such as the watercolors we are discussing today. Now, when you look at the mountain, the machine age seems very far from your mind. As you all know, Mount Chocorua is still every bit as beautiful as it was in Marin's day. Tracing his footsteps, I went to New Hampshire in late August and was truly overwhelmed by the majesty of the mountain and the beauty of the lake in front of it, which offers the most beautiful panorama. At this point, you will recognize the characteristic barren top of the mountain. The rock face reaching into the sky seems to give the mountain a personality that commands attention. Amazing too is how the pristine lake provides a stage to the mountain, focusing the view and allowing it to be seen to its full extent. Also remarkable is how accessible this view is by car and was at Marin's time. Marin would have driven up on Route 16 like visitors to the area do today, and as he traversed the wavy road, the mountain would have come in and out of view. The street then would have led him towards Mount Turkura Lake, where the mountain appeared in all its glory, seemingly untouched by civilization, while the road and a small parking lot were just steps away. It really is a wonderful place that invites swimming, hiking, picnicking. It's curious, though, that Marin wasn't all that interested in the lake. Did he just omit it, or did he work from a viewpoint elsewhere? When I studied the rendering of the mountain carefully, I realized that Marin must have looked from a slightly higher elevation, which revealed further barren peaks to the right of the summit. With a short car ride up the hill, we were indeed able to find the spot which had just been added to the preservation grounds a few years ago. Right next to the road now is a small parking lot with a view that Marin would have enjoyed 100 years ago. Curiously, seen from up here, the lake disappears behind the woods and, to my surprise, only a small patch of the lake appears. It is intriguing that this glimmering view might have given Marin the idea of painting the blue square on Mount Chocorua #1 that puzzled and delighted me in Cambridge. This is at least something that seemed plausible when I was there. Standing in that very spot where Marin was, I observed the changing light on the mountain and suddenly felt so strongly a connection that I was quite overwhelmed by its intensity. The clouds had moved and shaded much of the elevation, but a sudden shift had occurred, and the sun was now streaming onto the cliffs on top, making them glow the way Marin had seen them too. It was almost like the mountain was signaling something. Marin had articulated what it meant for him as an artist to be in nature. I had just grasped something of that myself. The photos, of course, are not as compelling as the watercolors, but you see the drift of it. So Marin wrote in 1928 again in a statement that's called By Himself in the magazine Creative Art. It seems to me that the true artist must perforce go from time to the elemental big forms, sky, sea, mountain, plain, and those things pertaining thereto to sort of re-true himself up, to recharge the battery. For these big forms have everything, but to express these, you have to love these, to be part of these in sympathy. One doesn't get very far without this love to enfold too the relatively little things that grow on the mountain's back, which if you don't recognize, you don't recognize. The mountain. I am looking at these watercolors. I am reading a statement by John Marin, how he wants to re-true himself by connecting with the big forms in nature. And I cannot help but think of Vladimir Kandinsky, who in the early years of the 20th century, when Marin established himself as a professional artist, was of course known not only as one of the most avant-garde artists of his time, but also as one of the great theorists whose work, such as concerning the spiritual in art, published in 1910, were read widely then and are still very readable and interesting to consider today. In the spiritual in art, this essay that Kandinsky published, the pyramid or mountain was the symbol of a coming spiritual age. And the Blue Rider, which was the name of the artist group Kandinsky and his friend Franz Marc founded, The Blue Rider was the artist who fought to usher in the new era, the spiritual era that was less concerned with self-interest, but with communal aspirations. Alfred Stieglitz, Marin's closest friend and mentor, had published excerpts of Kandinsky's essay in his journal Camera Work, pretty close to the original publication, and had bought a Kandinsky painting at the Armory Show, the landmark exhibition of international modern art, first presented in New York in 1913. While Marin doesn't explicitly refer to Kandinsky, the Russian artist's theories clearly informed many of the conversations in the Stieglitz circle, the closely connected group of artists that also included Marston Hartley from Maine, Arthur Dove, Georgia O'Keeffe, Charles Demuth, and others. For the fun of it, I'm showing a beautiful watercolor on the right by Kandinsky in the Harvard collection of a mountain range and an earlier painting at the Lehnbach House on the left. It offers a visual manifesto of Kandinsky's ideas. The mountain rises above the conflicts of the era, promising a less material and less selfish future. He calls on every artist evoking the power of music to step outside of conventions. Every man who steeps himself in the spiritual possibilities of his art is a valuable helper in the building of the spiritual pyramid, which will someday reach to heaven. Vasily Kandinsky articulated beautifully in this text. And it's very interesting to go back to Kandinsky and read it with fresh eyes today, because he very clearly, as an artist known to be one of the founding fathers of abstraction, he very clearly gives an important role to play to representational art, not only to abstract art. Must we then abandon utterly all material objects and paint solely in abstractions, he asks in a paragraph in this text. A rhetorical question, because then he says, as every word spoken rouses an inner vibration, so likewise does every object represented. To deprive oneself of this possibility is to limit one's powers of expression. What he's saying is that the inner necessity that gives rise to art is not wedded to any kind of expressionist vocabulary, but that the freedom that art is about is demonstrated in the wide range of applications. And that makes it a very compelling theory for anyone, from photographers to watercolorists, from Alfred Stieglitz to John Marin. Marin struggled with the concept of abstraction and often articulated the value of remaining attached to the visible world as a source of inspiration. It is not coincidental that he articulated many of his ideas in letters to Alfred Stieglitz, who as photographer found ways to reconcile the camera's dependence on representation and his artistic desire for expression. Stieglitz's friendship with Marin was the theme of a small exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. a few years back, and the photo I show here was presented there. Harvard's watercolor of a mountain range was actually purchased from Stieglitz's gallery, an intimate place, in 1929. So it really all comes together very closely. I have one more quote from John Marin, where he says, "I don't paint rocks, trees, houses, and all things seen. I paint an inner vision." He's now quoting, mocking abstract artist. Rubbish, he says. If you have an intense love and feeling towards these things, you try your damnedest to put on paper or canvas that thing. You can transpose, you can play with and on your material, but when you're finished, that's got to have the roots of that thing in it and no other thing, and so on and so forth. So John Marin, as much of a groundbreaking artist, modern artist as he was, he held on to the visible world as an inspiration. When you visit the Art Study Center, or you go to the exhibition that we're planning for the summer of 2023, you will see a whole range of watercolors by John Marin that are presenting his renderings of New York, the Adirondacks early in his career, seascape like this one that is incredibly beautiful and vibrant, beautifully preserved, so free in its spirit. And the late work is represented as well with the seascape from Maine from 1936 that shows some of the same features. If you look at the dots, for example, that we saw in the mountain ranges as well. He wanted to get away, as he said, from the regular life. New Jersey wasn't it for him. He really needed to leave in order to connect with the world around him. And he says the middle ground is something, the middleman is something that he hated and that he tried to flee. I'd rather have trash, for at least trash is honest as trash. It requires little effort and you do get a sort of kick. It's on that middle ground where the trouble begins. That's where we are so often, on that middle ground. Yes, I'm leaving soon in search of more trash or rainbows, anything to get away from this local trash and these local well-kept lawns, well-kept trees, well-kept houses, and well-kept people and presentable picture frames. We should have two selves, one held by the state to conform and transact, the other to Rome. That's what he wrote in 1927, and he was ready not only for a summer vacation, well-deserved, but also to really establish himself in New England on the coast of Maine at that particular time. He kept traveling and he kept enjoying new environments, including the White Mountains, to which he returned many times. And what I wanted to offer here with this in closing with this talk, of course, is a little bit of a question mark. Obviously, Marin thought of himself as a true pioneer, as someone who loved to escape the mindset of the limiting world around him. Many other artists before him had, of course, done the same thing, and even so many that Winslow Homer already in the 1860s, as a relatively young man, poked fun at all the artists, including himself, who lined up in the White Mountains, painting the scenery, and everybody lifting their spirits in front of the glorious mountain views, exactly in the way that Marin did, without acknowledging that his work already had a long tradition. Especially Mount Chocorua has a tradition that reaches back reached back already more than 100 years when Marin visited. And I just show you a tiny selection of these works by Thomas Cole and Sanford Gifford, absolutely wonderful artists who were inspired by this mountain and basically created a visual identity for the mountain that could stand for America as a whole. Cole integrates this resting figure, pondering the fate of the great nation that was rising around him, and Gifford included remnants of the Native American Indian past with an Indian village that he imagined on the banks of the Mount Chocorua. Let me close with a note of thanks to the Turkura Lake Conservancy, which offers to visitors a warm welcome today and an absolutely pristine environment to explore. And let me point out that still today, artists are engaging with the scenery, such as Anne Borges, whose watercolors grace the current newsletter of the Conservancy. When I visited, I was just delighted to see Anne's contemporary watercolor gracing this newsletter and relating back to the long artistic tradition of the place, renewing it and making it fresh. Artists are doing their part on preserving the beauty of our environment by helping us to see it, to pay attention, to grow, to love it, the way Marin described. I'm just delighted that the view still inspires awe and makes people want to capture it. I also want to invite you to take a look at Andy Shelkoff's New York exhibition of Marin's White Mountain work at his gallery, and with the help of the Marin estate, the legacy of Marin continues. Thank you everyone for joining today. Please feel free to share observations and ask questions in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim, for that incredibly full and illuminating presentation and such wonderful images. I'm looking for, I haven't had a chance to see these in person, so I'm looking forward to doing that, hopefully with you, Joachim. Let me pick up where you ended in terms of the long legacy or tradition of other artists working with this particular mountain. And I wanted to ask, did Marin himself, is there anything that he's written? Do we know whether he himself explicitly referred to the previous traditions of images or paintings of these mountains in particular, or just, you know, other landscapes of mountains in particular, as he embarked on his journey with the White Mountains?
Thank you, Soyoung. Yeah, it's very interesting to see that this perspective of a motorist kind of deprived the scenery that Marin was discovering of its history and the legacies. I think that he was, as a true modernist at this particular point in New England, interested in a very particular vision that didn't account for the native traditions or for the artistic traditions. It's fascinating that still today, when you visit the area, you are confronted with the legend of the mountain and the legendary interpretations why the tip of it is barren, but that it's relatively difficult to learn about living Native American traditions in the area, at least for novices like me. And for Marin, certainly all of these overlays of history and even prehistory were not relevant at this particular moment. It was then the following years where he went to New Mexico that he was in Santa Fe and Taos, and he visited festivals, Native American festivals, talked about his enthusiasm for dances, and actually began to integrate Native American motifs into his watercolors as well. But I couldn't find any of those references in his New Hampshire work.
Thank you for that answer. You should see that. I don't know if you'll be able to, but hopefully Erica can save. There's a number of, because you threw out the question of the mountain range, if anybody can identify on the, I believe the third image that you showed, there's a number of responses actually in the Q&A box.
I love it.
Ideas. So it's fantastic. But also a couple of questions pointing to the notion of landscape artists in particular, but also with the White Mountains and spirituality. And there's one specific question on whether I loved, and I think we all loved, that you honed in on the blue patch in the center and walked us through how that might represent the lake. Very convincing. But there was a question specifically on the blue square in the middle from number 1 watercolor, whether could it possibly a gesture of the artist's inner spirituality?
Yeah, I think that's my question. It is so interesting that the attitude that John Marin developed in the 1920s, and that was fostered by conversations with Alfred Stieglitz and with his friends at the time, didn't allow for any kind of acknowledgement of influences. They were really all eager to, especially Marin, as I now read again in his letters, to present himself as a rugged, independently minded spirit who was basically living with the country folk in Maine, with the fishermen, conversing with the people out there, a real outgrowth of American popular culture, and the sophistication of Kandinsky's vision and the eloquence that he brought to his theoretical writings. That was much more connected maybe with the symbolist world in Europe in the turn of the century, was really far away. But the emphasis on rejuvenating, retruthing experience of nature, which is, of course, anchored as well in the American idealism of the 19th century. That is something that he felt really was the essence of art. It's a spirituality. And Kandinsky was really after it. And so was Marin. So I feel that the connections there might be a little bit undervalued in the current literature and thinking about this particular group. And I think that it might have to do with the self-fashioning of these artists who really wanted to project an image of being independent from European traditions at this particular moment in time.
Thank you for that. Interesting you say sort of this rugged Americanism and being independent from European traditions. And you had obviously brought in Kandinsky. I have to say my initial reaction, seeing especially number one, was Cézanne, sort of in the visual at least anyway.
Yeah.
You know, I know obviously they're not contemporaries, but Cézanne having been such a trailblazer in that line between abstraction and representation and also with watercolors. Anyway, that's what I was thinking.
That's exactly right. And it would have been a wonderful topic to explore that. The Museum of Modern Art showed Kandinsky's drawings and an unbelievable show. And as I was visiting the Museum of Modern Art,
Cézanne's drawings,
the lessons that Cézanne had for art, I realized that really modern art is an outgrowth of the sometimes very cerebral work that Cézanne did. And his work on the representation of Mont Saint-Victoire is clearly a very, very important influence on John Marin. And his friend Marston Hartley, actually, who spent some time in France, went so far as basically copying Cézanne. I mean, the affection for Cézanne was very, very strong, and they all learned a great deal from him.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple more questions, but I am at last going to have to cut us off because of the time. But it was just such a joy to learn from you and to see the images, and how wonderful that you were able to take the trip yourself, and your photographs have provided an incredible dimension to understanding Marin's landscapes as well. So in closing, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again to Joachim, our wonderful presenter. Now, I know that many of you know that the Harvard Art Museum's just reopened to the public this past Saturday, September 4th. Yay, and I hope many of you have been able to visit. Advanced reservations are required for visitors and can be made up to 3 weeks in advance. I believe Erica has dropped the link in the chat to the registration, but you may please visit the museum's website for more information as well. And I want to note that while we are welcoming many of you into our galleries, our public programs will remain virtual through December 31, 2021. So I hope you'll continue to join us, especially with Art Talks. We will be posting the new schedule for this fall's lineup of Art Talks very soon. Our next big public event on Zoom is the opening lecture for our fall special exhibition, Devour the Land, War and American Landscape Photography since 1970, with the exhibition curator, Makita Best. That takes place next Friday, September 17th at 3 p.m. So we encourage you to go to our website and register. And finally, when you leave the session, you will receive a link to a short online survey, and we'd be very grateful for your feedback on our programs and hope that you'll take a moment to share your experience. Thank you again to Joachim, to all of you for joining us, and I bid you a wonderful afternoon.